Sup guys, in this video I want to go over the highest damaging Vanguard ships in the game, and roughly rank them relative to each other. This is going to be different from the Vanguard tier list, but sometimes player might just want to find whatever deals the most amount of damage without directly testing every single option. And just having an overall tier list is not going to cut it with ships like Eldritch and Laffy ranked as highly as they are for their utility. Something you should probably be aware of is that my experience with these ships are with my mostly maxed out fleet tech and equipment. For example, when I talk about Brest, I am talking about her with the plus 13 Rainbow Large Cruiser Gun with plus 13 Mogador Gun as secondary, and then she has another 60 firepower on top from fleet tech bonuses. If you're using transitional equipment or don't have the luxury of maxed Vanguard fleet tech, certain ships might perform relatively worse for you than me. This is kind of like how some fitness influencers will be on steroids and then show their absolutely horrendous workout program and pretend that it's what made them mutate into a horse. And instead of steroids, I'm hiding my fleet tech and equipment use. There might also be ships I left out that are really good, but I just haven't used them enough, so I won't include them. Also, I'm just going to be talking about single target DPS, but I'll mention other relevant factors that might come up with each ship. Also, and this is the final also, I'm just going to talk about equipment in this video, assuming that you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, I have an in-depth equipment guides playlist linked in the description. First up, to no one's surprise, is Hindenburg. If you have 2 plus 13 heavy cruiser guns, either an Unzen gun and a Drake gun for light armor, or 2 Hindenburg guns for medium armor, she pretty much deals the highest single target damage against both armor types. When using AP, her guns can hit up to 2 enemies, which makes her DPS even crazier against enemies like Kirov and Algerie meta. Since most of her damage comes from her guns and heavy cruiser guns are the weakest against heavy armor, it is also her weakness. She's not necessarily unusable against heavy armor, but there are better options. Next, Unzen is that better option against heavy that I mentioned. She gets a lot of damage from her barrages and torpedoes, and on average, you can expect her to hit the hardest out of all Vanguards against heavy armor on auto. And she's also up there against medium and light armor as well, but not as good as Hindenburg. Against medium, she's the second best after Hindenburg, but against light armor, she has a lot more competition. And that competition are Fushun and Taiyuan, who are tied with Hindenburg for the strongest against only light armor. However, their damage is much more consistent, and they deal better against enemies such as Helena meta with weird movement patterns and high movement speed. Fushun in particular really needs maximum investment in terms of reload in order to squeeze out an extra missile strike before the end of a lot of battles. Otherwise, I think Taiyuan is the safer choice with her bigger reload buff. In the next row, I ordered the ships by Generalist, Anti-Light Specialist, Anti-Medium Specialist, and then Anti-Heavy Specialist. First, Z52 deals about the same amount of damage across all 3 armor types, and Plymouth deals the most against light armor, even more so than Z52, and then Medium is her second best, about as much as Z52, and the least against heavy. Keep in mind I'm only talking about their personal damage output, and oftentimes their debuffs and survivability will make them much more valuable than the ships in S tier. They are both significantly weaker than the S tiers against the armor types that the S tiers excel against, and they aren't necessarily better against the armor types that S tiers are weak against either, but they might be. For example, Z52 might do more damage against the DDGs and Hindenburg against heavy, and Plymouth might deal a bit more than Unzen against light, but the difference isn't huge. I'm just not sure because I generally don't tend to use ships in situations that don't set them up for success, like Hindenburg against heavy. As for San Diego, her damage is kinda similar to Plymouth's, but it's hard to tell since she's always padded up with anti-air damage. I tested her in the raid event EX stage next to Plymouth, and they performed about the same, but I don't know if I would really recommend using her in single target contexts. The next 4 are all light armor specialists due to their loadouts. Anshan and Changchun would be better if you could afford to run more than 1 DDGs in real fights, but unfortunately the spots are too competitive, so you can only afford to bring 1 most of the time, in which case these two are generally going to be weaker than Fushin and Taiyuan. Mogador is slightly weaker than Hindenburg and the two DDGs against light armor, but she's obviously packed with so much utility that she can even find spots in heavy armor fleets, against which her own damage is the lowest. St. Louis is slightly weaker due to heavy cruiser guns having much worse ballistics than destroyer guns, but if you could park your Vanguard in front of the enemy the entire battle, then she would be about on par with the others in this tier, but otherwise if the enemy moves, then she's a little bit weaker. Next are the 4 large cruisers, who are all pretty much medium armor specialists, because the Rainbow Gun is by far the best and excels against medium armor. Although they do deal the most damage against medium armor in the tier, the gap between them and Hindenburg is quite big, while Mogador and Ibuki, for example, are closer to the DDGs and Unzen against light and heavy armor respectively. While the Rainbow large cruiser gun is also serviceable against heavy armor, it can't really compare to the damage that torpedoes bring against heavy. The Azuma gun exists as an option they can use against light armor, but that doesn't get them anywhere close to the damage of the ships that are actually good against light armor. Although if you can take advantage of their AoE damage against multiple enemies, things could be closer. If you're going to be using them with a plus 13 Rainbow gun and plus 13 Mogador gun as well, their damage against medium armor should exceed that of Plymouth and Z-52s. But oftentimes, you might want to save your plus 13 Mogador gun or Plymouth gun for your other ships. I am kind of just talking about peak DPS potential, but there are plenty of other reasons you would want to bring these ships, apart from damage output alone. The 4 large cruisers are also roughly ordered by their damage output, but I wouldn't say there is a huge gap between their DPS. Next is Wichita meta, who shares the same strengths as Hindenburg if you can keep her alive somehow. To be honest, I haven't used her extensively, and I don't think even at max potential she's as strong as Hindenburg, but she is for sure an S- at least. She doesn't ignore shields though, which could be an issue at times. The next 3 ships are all torpedo damage focused, so they're better than the rest of the ships in S-, although none are really better than Unzen. Ibuki gets quite close, and Shimakaze would be the same if she wasn't so fast that she zooms around the screen and misses all her torps. And Watarase relies on your flagship to trigger her insanely powerful barrage, which, depending on that, she could be stronger or weaker than the other 2. But even if you just use the normal IJN flagship, her damage is still great and not much behind Ibuki and Shimakaze against heavy, especially if there are multiple enemies. Watarase's damage is also decent against medium as well, about on par with Plymouth and Z-52. The next row, you probably don't have to reach for these ships because you should already have enough choices from the ships above, on top of the other ships you need to bring for things like tanking, anti-air, buffs, and so on, but they are still solid damage dealers. Jinsu meta deals good damage against heavy armor since she's a torpedo ship, but there is one caveat. You need to drop her HP to 0 at least once to activate her 2 extra torpedo salvos, which are both aimed. That part of her kit is needed for her damage to be particularly noteworthy. Next is A-Gear, whose only downfall is having a torpedo slot instead of a secondary gun like the other large cruisers. While that in itself is not a death sentence, her torpedo stats are very low, and the slot is mostly used to apply her slow, so her damage is a bit lower than that of the other large cruisers. Next is Napoli, who simply has her guns and that's it. Her damage is slightly better than the next few heavy cruisers, but not by much, although she also ignores shields on top of dealing more raw damage. You're probably not going to be bringing her for damage alone, but this is around the level that she's at. The other heavy cruisers are about the same. I ranked them roughly by DPS, but they're quite close to each other. Friedrich Karl needs to be in the tank position to attach her extra barrage to the rear ship, and San Francisco needs to go in the rear. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say something like that, you can start by reading their skills either in-game or on the wiki. Drake and Rune have fixed armor mods, so they can deal more damage than the other heavy cruisers in mixed armor scenarios, but the other cruisers get to choose the best gun to deal with a single target. For example, against a light armor enemy, Pittsburgh could bring Unzen gun plus Mogador gun, while Drake would be stuck with Drake gun and torpedoes, and Rune would be stuck with Hindenburg gun and torpedoes. So even though their stats and skills might look better than the other heavy cruisers, their inability to specialize their equipment leave them a little bit behind. Since I'm focusing on single target DPS here, I put them the lowest, but they're better, relatively speaking, against mixed armor situations like campaign. Next up is Kawakaze, who despite having all torpedo damage, deals the exact same damage across all 3 armor types. Being all torp means you can really boost her damage with Oxytorps, but she ends up being quite squishy as a result. Next, Kazagumo, who is another heavy armor specialist, is definitely a big step down from the others in the S- tier, but her damage is still solid and her total damage contribution is higher than that of even Unzen when used in the right fleet. Finally, I put Harbin in A tier, but I haven't used her in a long time, so I'm not sure if this is quite right. I think I mostly used her in campaign, so I don't really know if this placement is right for her single target performance, but I feel like it should be about right. If I'm wrong, then she would be lower, but definitely not higher. She also performs relatively equally across the board. Underneath the A tier, I have a special tier just for Aurora. She doesn't really do damage, but I don't think it makes sense to exclude her when talking about Vanguard damage. Basically, she contributes more the stronger the other 2 DPS in your fleet are. If you're only using the 2 strongest DPS Vanguards alongside Aurora, for example Hindenburg and Unzen against medium armor, then Aurora would probably be in the top of S- tier in terms of damage contribution, well beyond that of the entire A tier. However, if your 2 other Vanguards are weak, then she might not even make it onto the bottom of A tier. The thing about her though is that since her output comes from her skill alone, you don't have to sink a lot of resources into her and she'll pull a lot of weight regardless of enemy armor type, as long as your other Vanguards don't suck, of course. I personally rate her attributes quite highly, which is why you'll find her very high on my Vanguard tier list, but depending on who you ask, this could be considered a controversial opinion. Last is the campaign tier, where I put ships I typically only consider for a campaign. These ships have too much unaimed damage, but Shimanto alone could maybe get into A tier against a single target enemy, but the rest of them, probably not. By the way, Bayard is significantly stronger in campaign than the other 4 ships in this tier. In campaign specifically, she's about as strong as Plymouth, if not stronger. Shimanto is a torpedo ship and is better the more heavier armor enemies there are, while Scylla is the opposite and is better the more lighter armor enemies there are. This isn't a Vanguard tier list, so what isn't shown is Shimanto having much higher anti-air than Scylla, despite Scylla having decent anti-air herself. Felix and Neptune have decent damage output, but they stand out more due to their bulk. Once again, this is a tier list based purely on personal damage output, which is why it looks completely different from the overall Vanguard tier list, which you can find in the description. But in any case, I hope that it was helpful. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.